Carolina Panthers allowing
Powered by
534
Riverside FM.
points gave them the honor of moving into number one spot all time as far as points allowed. Welcome to Just the Stats NFL, the show that covers the NFL statistical leaders from the all-time greats to the current players leading the NFL. I am Ernie Jennings, your host. We stick to the stats and leave the gossip to the multitude of other shows that cover the NFL. So in our previous podcast, we covered the best teams in various offensive and defensive categories. But in this episode of Just the Stats NFL, we're going to do something quite a bit different. We're going to go to the other end of the categories, the opposite end. We'll do this once a year. We'll look at the teams that are the worst teams in NFL history and also from just the past season. We'll see how these teams from 2024 compared in the worst categories of the NFL. How do they stack up? The worst of the worst. And we're going to look at that right now on Just the Stats NFL. So we're going to start on the offensive side of the ball, and we'll start with, instead of what team scored the most points, we're going to look at what team scored the fewest points. And that would be the Cleveland Browns, who for the entire season, 17 games, scored 258 points. The Giants were second with 273, and the New England Patriots had 289. The only teams that were under 300 points for the season. Now, you contrast that with the Detroit Lions, who led the league with 564, and you can see that Cleveland Browns didn't have half of that amount of points. So when you look at the Cleveland Browns compared to the all-time worst teams, so what I've done here is I'm only going from 2021 to 2024 because that's when we have 17 games. The stats get too skewed if you try to go to 16 games or even farther back when we only had 14 games. I mean, you could do it by points per game type of average, but I'm just going to go with total points. But the record is held by two teams from last year. The New England Patriots and the Carolina Panthers both had 236 points that they scored compared to the 258 Cleveland had this year. So those are your worst teams. Cleveland with that 258 would be tied for fourth all time. Let's not move on down to the fewest yards. And obviously, when you're talking about these teams, you're going to see a lot of the same teams at the top, but not always. It just depends. But so looking at fewest yards, we'll start with total yards. The Carolina Panthers had, of last year, let's say 2023, they hold the all-time record with 4,510 yards, total yards in a season. When you're looking at this year, the Chicago Bears had 4,820. So 300 yards difference there. That Chicago Bear team would be the eighth worst scoring or worst yards in a season. And again, we're going 21 to 24 here, 2021 to 2024. So the Chicago Bears last year in 2024 had 4,820. New England Patriots had 4,964. Only two teams under 5,000 yards for the season. And again, if you want to just use that as a comparison, the Baltimore Ravens had the most yards last year with 7,224. So you're talking a huge difference there in yardage, 2,400 yards. Quite a difference. 17 games, you're talking quite a few yards fewer per game in that kind of a range. When you look at all time, again, it was three teams from 2023 all hold the record the top three spots for the worst teams as far as yardage go, with the Carolina Panthers with their 45-10, New York Jets 45-66, and the New England Patriots 4,696. The only teams under 4,700 yards. So not too good. Not too good at all. If we shift over to the passing yards and see how that looked, maybe which teams might not drop so far down when you're just talking passing. Again, you have the New England Patriots last year, only team under 3,000 yards passing, with 2,995. Chicago Bears were second with 3,086 total yards passing. Just not that good. And then you look at the other end of the scale. Last year, Cincinnati Bengals had 4,640 yards. So almost 1,500 yard difference, almost 100 yards a game, basically. All time, though, New England Patriots with 2,995 is nothing compared to the 2022 Chicago Bears, whose passing yardage was 2,219. That's horrible. The second worst one was the same year, Atlanta Falcons, but 2,699. I mean, well over 400 more yards passing. Chicago Bears of 2022, as far as passing went, which explains their record of only 3 wins and 14 losses that year. So that's a rough year. All right, let's move on down to the rushing yards. See who comes out on the wrong end of this category. That would be the Las Vegas Raiders, 1,357 last year in rushing yards, which explains why they took Giante as their first pick in the NFL draft this last draft season. He might get that many yards by himself easily, and then you tack on backups and everything else. They'll definitely move up out of this bottom level spot. So the Raiders had 1,357. The New York Jets were second with 1,561, and the Cincinnati Bengals were third with 1,574. The only teams under 1,600 yards. This explains why Cincinnati can't make the playoffs. They have an awesome quarterback, but they need a running game, and they had it at one time, but they just don't have it right now. So until they get a better running game, they're just going to have a hard time. Everybody's sitting on that pass. So we'll see how they do this year with their draft picks and so forth. But like I said, the Raiders with 1,357 was the worst rushing team. All time is the 2022 Tampa Bay Buccaneers with 1,308 yards, followed by the Raiders of past year, coming in at second. They're the only teams with under 1,400 yards rushing. And again, when you're looking, here's a dramatic difference. The Raiders had 1,357 yards in 2024. The Baltimore Ravens had 3,189. That's 2.5 times more yards, total yards rushing. That's massive. And again, you can look at records and see just how bad that was. Amazingly, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who hold the record with 1,308 yards rushing as the worst numbers, they still finished 8-9. So they were passing that ball pretty good, while the Raiders finished at 4-13. So that's more typical. When you don't have a running game, balanced offense, it makes it hard. All right, let's move on down to a different category, moving out of the yards and things like that. Let's look at conversion rates. How well did the teams convert on fourth down and in the red zone. Now, obviously, we're looking at the worst of the worst. Last year on fourth down percentage of fourth down conversions, the Kansas City Chiefs had a 70.6% conversion rate. They attempted 17 fourth down conversions and they converted 12 of them. Now you compare that. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me back that up. Actually, the Washington Commanders, and I remember this now, I don't know why I forgot, but the Washington Commanders had an 87% conversion rate. Kansas City was third with their 70.6, but they had an 87% converting 20 out of 23 fourth down conversions. So now you compare that with the worst of the worst. The Dallas Cowboys converted 35.7% of their fourth down attempts. 10 out of 28 they converted versus the 87. Tried 28 times and only converted 10 of them. Not too good, which is unfortunate for them. Now, I did the same thing here, and I didn't do this for red zone conversions, but for fourth down conversions, I did it from as far as what I consider all time from 2021 to 2024. And the worst conversion rate was 25% by the Cincinnati Bengals in 2022. But they only attempted 12 and they converted 3 of them for a 25% rate. The Chicago Bears the same year converted 32%, but they tried 25 times on fourth down and converted 8. And then you have the Dallas Cowboys from this past season. So the Dallas Cowboys were the worst. Pittsburgh Steelers were second in 2024 with 38.9%, converting 7 out of 18 attempts. And the other team that was under 40% was the Tennessee Titans, converting 9 out of 23 for a 39.1%. But you just compare that to the leaders. You're looking at the Commanders. These are all teams making the playoffs. Commanders, the Bills, the Chiefs, Eagles, 70% or better on fourth down attempts. Now, if we switch that over to the red zone, how well did the teams, or how bad, actually, I should be saying, how bad were these teams as far as converting red zone attempts into touchdowns? Well, the worst is the New York Giants from last year. 44 times in the red zone, 19 touchdowns for a 43.2% success rate. And then you look at the other end of the scale, the Baltimore Ravens, quite a few more times. Instead of 44 attempts, they had 66 times in the red zone. And out of that, they scored 49 touchdowns for a 74.2%. That's well above the second place Buffalo Bills as far as the best. And again, on the worst, it was the Giants, followed by the Dallas Cowboys at 46%, 50 times in the red zone, got a touchdown 23 times. New England Patriots were third, converting 22 out of 47 red zone attempts for touchdowns for 46.8%. These are the only teams under 47%. In fact, there were 7 teams that didn't even hit the 50% mark as far as getting in the red zone and making a touchdown out of it. So not too good. Big area where if you see some type of an improvement, you're going to see a whole different team in the amount of wins they have, especially close games. If you convert those red zone attempts into touchdowns instead of field goals or turnovers, makes a huge difference. It's the worst thing watching a team that you want to see win especially against a good team, and they kick a field goal when you know they need a touchdown, as if they think they're going to be able to stop a really good team consistently when they should know they can't. They need touchdowns versus field goals. So the better your red zone percentage, obviously, the better chance you have to win. All right. So that's the offense. Let's look at the defense and see how well some of these teams are on a defensive side of the ball. And we'll begin with points that they allowed on their defense. So the team that last year that allowed the most points were the Carolina Panthers, and by a wide margin. They allowed 534 points. That's a lot. Not only is that a lot, the second place team as far as the worst teams as far as scoring defense was the Dallas Cowboys, 468. So you're talking about a 66-point difference. That's huge. After that, Tennessee Titans, 460, were third. San Francisco 49ers, which you always think of, and the same with the Dallas Cowboys, you often think of them as having strong defenses. San Francisco 49ers allowed 436 points to come in fourth. Last year is the worst in allowing points by the other team. That Carolina Panthers allowing 534 points gave them the honor of moving into number one spot all time as far as points allowed. Second was the 2023 Washington Commanders, I should say, with 518, and then the Jets of 2021, 504. The only teams that have allowed 500 or more points. And in fact, Dallas coming in second last year with 468, even though that's a huge point differential between them and the Panthers, still put the Cowboys as the fourth worst as far as points allowed with the 468 points. So that's not good either, obviously. And you compare that with the team with the best last year. The Los Angeles Chargers allowed 301 points. So between Carolina Panthers and the Los Angeles Chargers, you're talking about a 233-point difference. That's almost, it's almost as if the Panthers allowed twice as much, almost, getting close. So obviously, the Panthers need to do some work on the defensive side of the ball. Actually, the whole team, their offense is up in these categories as far as the worst of the worst as well. So they've got a long way to go to improve their team. But we'll see what they do with a new quarterback. That should definitely help. And we'll see how they come out in 2025. All right, let's move to the most yards allowed category. And again, Carolina Panthers with 6,877 yards allowed, followed by my team, the Jacksonville Jaguars, unfortunately, up here. And I'm surprised, actually, that I haven't seen them in more categories up in the top three or so. But they came in second with 6,629 yards allowed. And again, this gives the Carolina Panthers the honor of moving into first place as far as the worst of the worst in yards allowed with their 6,877, passing the 2021 Jets, who had 6,760. Jaguars, who finished second worst last year, that put them at fourth all-time worst time. And really, you're looking at the Panthers with 68, almost 6,900 yards. Jaguars a little over 66. And then you have the Saints with 6,459, and then there's a big drop to the Colts with 6,100. So it drops pretty drastically. 7 teams allowed 6,000 or more yards. The other end of the scale were the Philadelphia Eagles, who only allowed 4,732 yards. So huge difference there. You're talking 2,100 yards. Big difference. So Carolina Panthers, again, worst of the worst. But you know what? They can only go up, you hope. If you're a Carolina Panther fan, you hope that they can't do any worse. That's how I feel about the Jaguars. All right, most yards. Let's shift it over to the passing. Who gave up the most passing yards? And this is where the Jaguars do finish number one in most passing yards allowed last season with 4,375 yards, whereas the Carolina Panthers dropped all the way to number 10. But you'll see why in just a second. And believe it or not, the Baltimore Ravens were second with 4,150 yards allowed passing. And obviously, if you took a hard look at it, some of that probably comes from teams playing catch up against them since they were such a good team. Whereas the Jaguars, I think teams realize you can almost pass at will. And I've said this before with the Jaguars, but they make bad quarterbacks look good and good quarterbacks look like all-stars. So hopefully for the Jaguars' sake, we see a big difference on that coming up in the 2025 season. And again, the same with the Detroit Lions. They were third with 4,148. So these are teams that are good teams where other teams are ending up having to play from behind. And so they're passing more. You have huge deficits come the fourth quarter. You see a lot of garbage time passing against them, that type of thing. You compare that 4,375 to the Philadelphia Eagles, who only allowed 2,961. Huge difference. All time, Baltimore Ravens from 2021 allowed 4,742 yards, which is the most. Only team over 4,700. The only other team over 4,600 was the Tennessee Titans from 2022 with that 4,671 yards. The Jaguars from this past season would have finished number 7th, or did finish number 7th all time with that season they had from last year. All right, let's look at the rushing yards. The Carolina Panthers allowed 3,057 yards rushing against them. And this is why their passing number was number 10. 3,057 again gives them the honor of being the all-time leading team. And again, I'm going from the years 2021 to 2024 because of 17 games. But 3,057 yards. The New Orleans Saints were second with 2,404. So over 600 yards more allowed by the Panthers than the Saints. They definitely need help on the against the rushing game. I mean, their defense, is like a sieve if you're giving up that many yards. And you look at the Baltimore Ravens, who allowed 1,361 yards. I mean, you're talking a third of that, basically. That's a huge difference. I mean, it just makes it rough on your team when you're on the field. If you're running and allowing 3,000 yards, your defense is on the field a lot because running just wears you down. And if you can't stop it, it's difficult. So those are the worst two. Washington Commanders and Dallas Cowboys and the Chicago Bears all gave up over 2,300, but really nothing compared to the Carolina Panthers. And in fact, the Carolina Panthers, who moved into the number 1 spot, beat out the Houston Texans of 2022, who had 2,894 yards. So passed them by quite a big margin. And if you're wondering, when you give up 3,057 yards, you're doing it at least the Panthers were at allowing 5.2 yards a carry. So why wouldn't a team run if you're getting that many yards per attempt? So that was a rough year for Carolina, and hopefully for their sake, they improve going into the next year. All right, let's look at fourth down conversions as far as allowing fourth down conversions, not making them as far as your offense goes, but allowing them. So again, if you can't stop a team, you can't get your defense off the field. It really makes it hard. The Tennessee Titans and the Las Vegas Raiders had the same percentage of 76.9% allowing of fourth down conversions. And they both had the same. 13 times teams attempted a fourth down conversion, and the teams made it 10 out of 13. Both had the identical. Third, very close, were the New York Jets, who allowed 16 out of 21 fourth down attempts to be converted at a 76.2%. So all three of them were over 76%. The Steelers were, which is a little surprising. You don't think of the Steelers as a team would give up a lot of fourth down conversions, but they did, but at a 68%. So 8% lower than the top three, which is a pretty decent margin. They allowed 15 out of 22 to be converted. So those are your top four teams. When you look at all time, well, those three, the same three, the Titans, the Raiders, and the Jets, who all allowed over 76% in fourth down conversions, moved them into the 1, 2, and 3 spot. They beat out the 2022 Tennessee team, Tennessee Titans, who had a 73.1%. So Tennessee was able to beat itself as far as fourth down conversions. Obviously, an area that needs improvement. When you can look at the other end of the scale, the Minnesota Vikings last year allowed 37.1% on fourth down conversions. So half, even better than half, or less than half, of the 76.9% that the Tennessee Titans and the Raiders had. And that's, in fact, with Minnesota had 35 attempts against them on fourth down and with 13 converted. So a lot more attempts as well, and they still had a much lower rate. Looking at the red zone percentage, again, this is just a tough stat to look at, really, when you think about it. Dallas Cowboys allowed 75% of red zone conversions. 56 times the offense of the other team was in their red zone, and they allowed 42 touchdowns for 75%. Way above second place San Francisco 49ers at 68.4%. So 7% difference. The 49ers allowed 39 touchdowns in 57 attempts. It's huge. There were 4 teams that allowed less than 50% last year, with the Chargers being the first at 45%. So you see a 30% difference in allowing the touchdowns in the red zone from the Dallas Cowboys to the Los Angeles Chargers. 75%. All right. We'll move on to other defensive position categories. In 2008, the Kansas City Chiefs only were able to sack the quarterback 10 times. That's not good. And that's really bad, actually. When you look at the New England Patriots last year, only got to the quarterback 28 times. And that was the worst. Atlanta Falcons 31 times. Whereas you look at the Denver Broncos, who sacked the quarterback 63 times. So 10 times, that's really bad. Now, again, that's 16 games versus 17, but still, you throw in an extra game, they're not getting that low. And in fact, when you're talking about 28 sacks that your team was able to record, that just puts you tied for 155th all time. So really, this is a category that you're not going to see, unless the team's really bad, you're not going to see a team move into the top 10 as far as the worst teams as far as sacks go. But 28 still is not good. You're talking about less than 2 a game at that rate. So New England Patriots, 28, Atlanta Falcons, 31, Tennessee Titans, Carolina Panthers, 32. And again, we saw the Carolina Panthers with the yards they allowed, conversion rates, percentages, and stuff. So and they're only sacking the quarterback 32 times. They're just not able to get to the quarterback. The Carolina Panthers, 32 might not be that bad considering they gave up so many rushing yards. Teams aren't even throwing it that bad, so that much against them. But all right, That's sacks. Not too good there for the New England Patriots. And I would expect to see an improvement over that this year. Let's look at our last category, and that's interceptions. See how the interceptions go. Now, the worst team as far all time for interceptions were the San Francisco 49ers, who in 2018, not that long ago, only recorded 2 interceptions in their season. 2. That's not many. So we're going to look at this past season, 2024. The Cleveland Browns were only able to record 4 interceptions. New York Giants 5, Jacksonville Jaguars 6. Those were the 3 worst teams. So Cleveland Browns, that would move them tied for 4th with 4. You had the 2018 49ers with 2, then 2 times, quite a few years apart, the Houston Texans, or Houston Oilers the first time, Houston Texans the second time. The 1982 Houston team had 3, and then the 2020 Houston team had 3. And then you have last year's Cleveland Browns with 4. So they were the worst this year. And again, if you look and compare that to the best team, who was the best team by far, actually? The Minnesota Vikings had 24 interceptions that their defense was able to record. The Texans were second with 19. So pretty big difference, actually. But 24 for the Vikings, 4 for the Browns. That's just huge. And it really explains a lot as to why Minnesota was so good and Cleveland wasn't. So those are a look at the stats from various categories of the worst of the worst. Hope you enjoyed that. It's a little different than the typical type of podcast I'll be presenting, but it's fun to look at and see how teams are. And what'll be interesting to see is how they look next year. Hopefully they've shifted the teams that are worst of the worst and they're up into the best of the best, or at least in the middle where they're not being mentioned in such a negative light. But that's the goal of every team, is to improve in whatever area needed. But when you look at these numbers, you can see that certain teams just need a complete overhaul sometimes. And they're probably in that process of trying to do that. So in the next podcast, we're going to start looking at each team of the NFL individually. And we'll start in the AFC, and specifically the AFC East. And what we're going to do is look at the best players, the greatest players on each team, see how they compare against the 2024 season of that team and against the all-time players within the entire NFL. So that'll be fun. It'll give you a chance, if as your team comes up, if you have a favorite team, to see how the players from they're currently playing compared to the players from that team in the past. And we'll be able to look at what players going into 2025 are going to be moving into the top of the list, top 3, top 10, whatever it might be. And we'll look at the team as a whole as well. Not too much, but more specifically the players. But we'll even look at the coaches. What coaches were the best coaches for each team as far as wins go. So that's what we're going to be doing from now to the season start. Once the season starts, we'll shift into a completely different format of looking at teams and the games they played each week. So that'll be completely different. So I hope you enjoyed looking at these stats. And as I said, we'll start next week in the AFC East, and we'll start with the first place Buffalo Bills. Please like this podcast and subscribe. Positive reviews will be helpful for growing this podcast. And I just thank you for listening. And this is a wrap for this episode of Just the Stats NFL. Until next time, tschüss.